As the Speaker's Parade marked the start of today's sitting in the Senate, one member was noticeably absent. Senator Lynn Bayek was nowhere to be seen as calls for her resignation emerged over her defense of the residential school system.
It equals saying that what Hitler did to the Jewish was good.
NDP MP Romeo Saganash is a residential school survivor and wants the Conservative senator to step down for comments she made on Tuesday. Bayek offered unprompted support of residential schools during a Senate discussion on Indigenous women in prison.
In memory of the kindly and well-intentioned men and women and their descendants, perhaps some of us here in this chamber, whose remarkable works, good deeds, and historical tales in the residential schools go unacknowledged for the most part.
The comments stunned fellow Senator Murray Sinclair, who oversaw the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
I am a bit shocked that you still hold some views that have been proven to be incorrect over the years, but nonetheless, I accept that you have the right to hold them.
Bayek, who is a member of the Aboriginal Peoples Committee, has made similar comments in the past, telling senators in January, "I was disappointed in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report in that it didn't focus on the good."
Welcome to the Magnificast. I'm Dean.
And I'm Matt.
And in this episode, we're talking with Melanie Kampen, a doctoral student at Emmanuel College in Toronto, about her work on residential schools in Canada and their theological motivations. So if you don't know what residential schools are, we'll tell you in this episode. But to get us started here, Canada had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that ended in 2015. And they concluded that the purpose of residential schools was to separate children from their families and interrupt the transmission of Aboriginal cultural heritage between generations. So it was a colonialist project to basically separate Indigenous people from their communities and westernize and Christianize them. However, as you heard in the opening audio to this episode, some people, like Senator Lynn Bayek, are colonialist ideologues, so we thought it might be good to have Melanie share a little bit about her research, especially because residential schools are mostly run by Christians, so that poses a kind of interesting problem that, Christians should be hopefully still wrestling through today. So in this episode, we talked about some of the theological reasons that made Christians, and still make Christians, willingly create these kinds of colonialist projects. We talk about Christianity and colonialism generally, and the complications of Mennonite identity specifically, because that's where a lot of Melanie's work is located. So all that and more, but stick around to the very end, because we're also going to share some more details about the upcoming Virilio Summer Reading Group through the Magnificast, which you can join by supporting us on Patreon.
All right, every week on the Magnificast, we start off by just catching up with one another, so we're going to do that right now. But since Melanie's here as our guest, maybe we can start with her. Melanie, what have you been up to in this last week?
Just working on a conference paper that I'll be presenting in a couple weeks at Anabaptist conference in BC. Pretty much that, yeah.
Yeah, cool. What's your paper about?
It's about decolonizing Mennonite theological method.
That sounds really interesting and worthwhile. I imagine we'll talk about that more in a minute. So, Dean, what have you been doing, man?
What have I been doing? The big news is we bought a couch from IKEA. It's the first piece of new furniture we ever bought. And we
really exciting.
It's very exciting. We spent a whole day putting it together and then found out that part of it was defective.
Oh, no.
So then we spent more time talking to IKEA, and instead of sending us like a new part that would be very easy to replace, they want us to dismantle the entire couch, and then they're going to bring us a new couch that we'll put together, I guess, which is very exploitative. So, yeah, I never realized that, I'm just unpaid labor for IKEA until I had to undo all the labor that I already did.
Whoa. You should ask IKEA to reimburse you for that.
Yeah,
we are.
Yeah, just send them an invoice.
Yeah, that's a great idea. That's super funny. Cool.
Matt, what about you? What's the big haps?
I've just been grading. It's like the end of the semester, and I'm just grading all the time, every day. And I'm sick of it. I wish I could stop. I'm almost done, though, and it feels good to be almost done because I know I can do lots of fun things after I grade. I also watched Twin Peaks. That's back. Twin Peaks is a big part of my life, and I watched the new eps, and they're very good.
I guess, I don't know, is this a bad time to confess that I haven't watched Twin Peaks?
Yeah, it's very bad.
I've
I won't
never
then.
seen it. I don't even know what it's about.
Oh, no.
Sorry.
It's okay. It's a good TV show. David Lynch and Mark Frost directed it in the 80s, and then it ended in a sort of weird spot. And like many years later, it's back, and people are losing their minds about it.
Well, that's exciting for you and for other people who are losing their minds.
I'm glad that you could be excited for me.
I am. Proximity excitement. I forgot to mention, I got the chance to meet some of your students, Matt, here at ICS. And some other good Twitter folks. Jonas and Kat from Calvin came, and Summer and Jacob, your students, came. And a bunch of other students came for an undergraduate conference we did, and they are very smart. So kudos. Good job teaching them very well.
Dude, I'm so psyched that they got to go. I haven't talked to them since they've been back. I need to ask them how it went. I heard that Summer got lost on transit or something, so that's not good. But no big deal. They said it was fun on Twitter, or at least it sounded like it was fun on Twitter.
That's all that counts. If it's fun on Twitter, then it's really fun.
Yeah. That's what's important. All right. Melanie, maybe you could just start off by telling us, I don't know, like where you do the research at, where you're a student, what you do there, what it's like. I don't know, any of those things.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'm in the second year of my PhD program at Emmanuel College, which is the United Church affiliated college at Toronto School of Theology, which is comprised of 7 different denominational colleges. And I'm actually part of the new PhD conjoint program with U of T, which is pretty exciting to have a conjoint degree like that and benefit from some of the larger university stuff. I'm working with Marilyn Legg, who is my supervisor, Dr. Marilyn Legg. She is an amazing supervisor, extremely supportive, and I have the opportunity of TAing with her in her class, Christian Ethics in Context, which I've done twice now, and it's really fun, and it makes me excited for when I get to teach my own classes, so that's really fun. And yeah, other than that, I'm done my coursework now, so just trying to wrap up a few papers before I start comps in the fall.
Nice. What's your doctoral research that you're working on now?
Everything is kind of geared towards the dissertation in my program, which is really nice. I don't end up doing like a ton of side work, which can get you distracted from your project. So working on basically Mennonite involvement in residential schools in Canada, and sort of both historically, but also what's going on theologically there.
Yeah, that is a very interesting thing, and surprise, also why we wanted to talk to you on this podcast. So maybe you could... So I'm from the United States, even though I live in Toronto now, and I didn't really know anything at all about residential schools till I moved to Canada, and also don't know that much about them still. So if you could give, I don't know, like for people who've never heard of a residential school, like what are you talking about? What are they?
Yeah. So Indian residential schools were primarily funded by the Canadian government, and then basically run by different churches. So Catholic, Anglican, United, Methodist, and then a couple of Mennonite ones as well. And the purpose of them was to take Indigenous children away from their homes, away from their reservations, and put them in schools altogether where the purpose was to assimilate them, basically. A common line that's heard is like to kill the Indian and save the man, kind of a thing. And so kind of trying to like redeem the Indigenous person from their squalor. That was kind of the approach to it. That was the understanding as Indigenous people as very inferior to Western civilization. And so the idea was that adults were sort of unredeemable. Maybe some could be converted, but really the goal was to get children into Christianity as quick as possible and assimilated into Western culture. And so the children often weren't allowed to speak their language at the schools. Their hair was cut, which was very significant because a lot of Indigenous cultures, certain hairstyles and braids were very important to a sense of identity and spirituality. And then just like Westernization of clothing, catechesis, and basically, conversion. And then a lot of the schools had big problems with sexual abuse and physical abuse of children. There are even cases of medical experiments and forced sterilization done on Indigenous children, Indigenous women. And a lot of children died and experienced a lot of trauma in these schools.
Could you give a general time frame that some of these things are happening, or at least like the time frame that you're focusing on in your research?
Yeah, I don't remember when the first school started. I feel like it was in the late 1800s, but it might have been because I get the U.S. and Canada mixed up too. But it was happening throughout the 20th century, and what is even more significant perhaps than when it started was when it ended, which the last school closed in Canada in 1996.
Oh my God.
Which is appalling.
Yeah, that is insane. So fresh. I don't know. It's like scary when these things don't feel like distant histories or something. Time is like very short.
And I guess just the other thing that I wanted to say was the U.S. has a similar history, but I think they were just called like missionary boarding schools, and the relationship between the government and the church I think might have been different. I can't speak to that completely.
So you mentioned a lot of them were run by churches, and then there's a kind of intrinsic goal of Christianizing, students. And I was really intrigued by earlier you were talking about how you're focusing on some of the theological questions behind residential schools. So what do you mean by that? Like, why would a church, for example, sort of take this on as a consistent thing with whatever their Christian mission or vision or something?
Mm-hmm. For a lot of churches, it was sort of based around their interpretation of the Great Commission. So the idea that we have to Christianize the world, and that, Jesus is for everybody, and we're sort of semi-responsible for the salvation of everyone on earth, even though God is the one who saved. It's humans, we better do our part in making sure as many people are saved as possible. So it was really focused on that kind of internal conversion. For Mennonites specifically, I don't really know. There is that same broad focus on salvation. So I guess what was really interesting to me about Mennonites was their particular commitment to pacifism and nonviolence on the one hand, but then being involved in something like residential schools. And what was it that they didn't recognize that as a form of violence, and instead a really good thing that they were doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting because this seems like something that is pretty violent in a lot of obvious ways, I guess. But they see it more. They saw it as more as evangelical, being evangelizing or something than systematic violence against people, huh?
Yeah, definitely.
So what do you think? Christians, massively participated in this on purpose. The government didn't have to coerce them into it. It was kind of like a glad, we'll do that because we're supposed to. That's like what Christians do. Do you feel like in Canada, I know the government and Indigenous people are, slowly trying to figure all this out and work on it, and they had this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I know that in some of the calls to action coming out of that commission, there are a lot of responsibilities put on churches to, own up to these things, apologize for them. I'm Catholic, so a lot of that burden falls on the Catholic Church because I know that they operated the majority of those schools. In your research, kind of finding the theological drive for having these schools, how do you find Christians are kind of now wrestling with the legacy of their participation, and I don't know how they're trying to make amends for that or something, or is that just like not really even on the table in a lot of cases?
Yeah, there definitely have been several apologies issued by churches. I know the Anglicans have, the United Church has, I think twice. They had one in the 80s, and then I think, don't quote me on that, and then like one more recent. As far as I know, the Mennonite Church has not issued an apology. I think the Catholic Church has also issued an apology. It's really interesting, actually, to look at those different apologies. I had done some work like a year ago on looking at the different apologies and sort of what they mean and what their purpose is, and what effect they kind of have. And so one thing that I found was basically all of them explicitly ask for forgiveness, and I thought that really rubbed me the wrong way, because it was almost like they were apologizing, and now the onus for reconciliation was on the victims, and like even in just like a very personal sense, like if someone does harm to you and then like apologizes, if they then like ask for forgiveness, it's like, wait, what? No, now you like feel like you're forced to forgive, or like it's like, well, if you say no, then you're hindering reconciliation, right? And so it's like if you ask for forgiveness, like I basically said, you better be prepared for no to be a legitimate answer. But because it's like Christians asking for forgiveness, it's like there's this sort of hidden agenda of like, but that you can't actually say no, right? Because Christians are supposed to forgive. So it's all kind of weird and like tied together. It's weird, and it comes across as manipulative to me, even if it doesn't intend to be.
Yeah, it sounds kind of hollow, just asking for something where there's no real like nothing really attached to it, right? There's no stakes for the Christian denominations.
Yeah.
Since you work at these kind of theological levels, Melanie, this reminds me of a thing that just happened in the U.S. where there's a Jesuit-run school that part of their history is that I guess they sold a bunch of black people as slaves to pay for, I don't know, building stuff or whatever. Anyway, the Jesuits were, they issued a big apology for it, but there were barely any material ramifications. I think the biggest thing was they decided to give preferential admissions to descendants of the specific slaves that they sold. And it was like just extremely low stakes and very bad. Do you think there's kind of a pathology in, I don't know, Christian apologies and forgiveness that just stops justice from ever being administered? Like, how would you articulate that?
Definitely. I agree with you. That's so gross in so many ways. Yeah. And like to then assume that the thing that, the black people that they're apologizing to want is like admissions to their school. That's so strange. Like, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk, especially in the US, about reparations, and specifically material reparations. In Canada also talk about, financial reparations a lot. Not as much as the language of reparations gets used, but we have a lot of settlement agreements that are in a court between Indigenous communities and other organizations and industries. It's kind of it's hard to describe. And that's part of the problem, is that we don't really have the language to describe sort of that pathology or what's like going on. One of the ways I've tried to get at that is through the language of spectrality. I found to be really helpful, and like other forms of affect theory. I guess I do a lot of theory in my theology too, just because I find it really helpful. Because I'm analyzing systems and structures of violence, and theology tends to lack language in that, so I draw on a lot of theory. And it seems to me that a lot of sort of white settlers, both in Canada and the US, kind of get stuck in their guilt, and there's this sense of haunting that they sort of can't deal with then, and I don't really know what happens psychologically, but there's this kind of block and like refusal to take responsibility, and that really just, puts a spoke in it and doesn't allow any way forward. I think you're right. Like, with the current frameworks, there's not really a way to imagine like real justice or reconciliation, because like the truth work can't even be done yet.
Right. I want to talk to you a little bit more about that spectrality thing. Sorry, Matt, I'm just asking all the questions.
No, it's
okay. Well, I was going to ask Melanie to maybe say a little bit about that paper that I heard you give, because you mentioned spectrality there, and if I remember right, so you were kind of doing some archival work on one of these residential schools in particular, looking through photographs and yearbooks, and I just thought that was such an interesting way to get at what's happening in those schools, because it takes it out of the level of a historical event that happened that you could sort of analyze, and it puts you in touch with, actual human children, and also the apparatus of administrators, etc., that are organizing those children, and it's just very uncomfortable. And I don't know, could you just say something about what you were talking about in that and how that relates to spectrality as you're using it?
Sure. So I guess it kind of started with my visit to the Mohawk Institute Residential School in Brantford, Ontario, which is Haudenosaunee territory. Hearing about what happened there, walking through the school, feeling uneasy. And I had taken a course with Shireen Razak, who is incredible. She was teaching at OISE here in Ontario. Now she's at UCLA. And she made us read a couple of things on spectrality, and I found that to be a good way to get at what I was feeling, because there was no other framework in which I could answer the question of how to talk about like uneasiness, or even better, like the feeling of an unsettling feeling, like, and all the meanings of that intended, like a settler feeling unsettled.
Yeah.
And so I found that, hauntology really gave me some language to talk about what's happening in the background of these things, sort of like, the present absences, the feelings that people get. I've got the paper in front of me here, and there's just this really good quote by Avery Gordon that I want to read if I can.
For sure.
From her book, Ghostly Matters, Haunting the Sociological Imagination. And so Gordon writes, I'm quoting, "Haunting is constitutive of modern social life. It is neither pre-modern superstition or individual psychosis. It is a generalizable social phenomenon of great impact." So it's not, when she's talking about ghosts, it's not this like airy-fairy, like ghosts that you see in movies, whatever. It's a social phenomenon. And then she continues, "As a concept, mediation with ghosts describes the process that links an institution and an individual, a social structure and a subject, a history and a biography. In haunting, organized forces and systemic structures that appear removed from us make their impact felt in everyday life in a way that confounds our analytic systems and confounds the social separations themselves." And that's the end of the quote. So it's this really taking up a different language and a different framework for talking about how social systems are constructed and how they're being operated and maintained. So I did that by looking at residential school yearbooks, because looking at them also makes me very uneasy. I realized that yearbooks are actually like a very powerful way of constructing social memory for a group. Because in yearbooks, you're not going to show like you're only going to show happy moments. You're not going to show, anything bad or suspect that happened, because yearbooks are texts that are meant to curate a specific kind of memory, namely a good memory. It's a nostalgic document.
Right.
And nostalgia is also, a form of colonial desire. And so you can see that in a lot of ways in the yearbooks, especially considering that the students wouldn't have any agency in the construction of the yearbook, like they maybe put pictures in and stuff. But the way it's constructed, the little editorial pieces that are written in it, the captions, inserted scripture verses, that's all really done by the editor, and then it always is prefaced with a note from the principal, which is always really striking in terms of, noting how much good they believe they're doing in this school.
That's really fascinating. Could you talk a little bit more about the yearbooks? Is there one image or set of images that really strike you that kind of drive the spectrality of those things for you?
I guess a couple of things. I guess the images, the portraits of the children. Generally, yearbooks have a portrait of everyone who's in the school. So just the varied expressions, I think, and I think what struck me the most was how sort of banal and benign it looked, and I think it was meant to do that. I think it's meant to be to show how much good the school is doing and how well integrated everyone is, and I'm sure that's the kind of language they would use. And how happy everyone is here, and that to me made me really uneasy because I know of conflicting stories. Stories that they were not generally happy places. Right. And I guess there was another picture that really made me uneasy. It was they were baking bannock together, and they also made cradle boards. And I just thought to myself when I saw that, man, that would be such a good way to assuage any, settler fears about that the school might not be good, or because it looks like cultural inclusion, But to me, it just seemed like it wasn't really. It was a way, of saying, oh, we'll take a couple of elements from this specific indigenous nation and include them, and sort of deceive ourselves into thinking that this is some sort of intercultural experience.
Right. Yeah. That is pretty troubling.
Because I can just when I'm looking at that picture, I can hear in my head another white settler like myself saying, "But they made cradle boards. But they baked bannock." So it's really not full assimilation. They clearly have respect for the... No, that's not at all what's happening, I don't think.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's one more tool of making that system of violence more palatable, both to the oppressor and the oppressed, I guess, in some ways, because you give the illusion that you're actually respectful, when in fact it's just one more tool of domination. It's even worse.
Right. It's an even less recognizable sort of technology of maintaining the system of oppression.
Yeah, and reproducing that system too through the very people who are caught into it, which is makes me feel queasy.
Yeah.
So that particular school that you were looking at the yearbooks from, was that a Mennonite school?
Yeah, it was a Mennonite-run residential school.
Okay, so what you were mentioning the principal note in the beginning. So what does a Mennonite principal say, for example, at the beginning of a yearbook?
Okay, there's two that I want to read.
Okay.
All right, so one is quote by principal in 1971. And so the opening comment includes, there's a comment on the Ojibwe and Cree hunting traditions that he writes, and then followed by this exclamation, "But that was long ago, you live now." So that was really striking.
Yeah.
A very clear installation of like a hierarchy of civilization.
Yeah.
And what, is inferior and what is civilized. And then there's another one from the first available yearbook that I found, 1966. I think the school opened in 62, so this is from 66. The principal then reflected on his strong belief in, the goodness of the school. So he writes, "Often I would sit back and watch the school buzz with activity, and then I would contemplate, what effect will this have on student lives, on staff lives, on my life, on the Indian people as a whole, on our Canadian nation, on the world, on the universe, on eternity. The influence of this activity will never end. The past the past belongs to historians, the present belongs to us, and the future is in God's hands." And it blew my mind, because he's right, but for the wrong reasons.
Right.
like in a bad way, not in a good way that he thinks. So I think it was really striking to me because so often I hear a white settlers, react to things and be like, well, I don't think they, really knew what they were doing. It's like the more that I read these documents, the more I'm convinced they knew exactly what they're doing, and they thought it was really, really good.
Yeah, I think a good note.
So the impetus to take responsibility is like way stronger the more I read.
It's a good note to make because I think a lot of times when people talk about sort of systemic violence, we end up talking, about the banality of evil or whatever, and people just following orders. But I think from what you've read there, it's pretty clear that the folks involved with residential schools really bought into that ideology, and they weren't just doing it because someone told them to do it. They were doing it because they felt the moral imperative to do that.
Yeah.
And that.
And this school too, in particular, was started by a mission organization, and then a couple years later started to be funded by the government. Sometimes people like to sort of put more blame on the government, and but I really don't think. I just see that as like what Eve Tuck, an Indigenous writer and academic here in Ontario, calls a settler move to innocence. It's just excuses.
Yeah, it's crazy too to think about the way that you're coming at these problems as theologically driven and theologically motivated, because it's really hard to think of any other reason that you would feel as though your work as a principal would have such cosmic significance. And it's like very scary in that way. And there's just something so powerful about theological motivations, both, it's like it can be the most emancipatory discourse precisely for that reason, and the most like horrifically oppressive hegemonic discourse.
Yeah. Well, on that note then of, I guess, was it the church or was it the government, or who's to blame there? Since it is a Mennonite school, I think we should probably get into the Mennonite reputation that's sometimes romanticized, especially by people on the more political left side of the spectrum. That Mennonites are radical anti-statists and they're anti-violent and everything like that. But this gives an interesting counter narrative to that romanticization. So how does that play into your project?
Yeah. So one of the first things that led me into this project, besides sort of personally wanting to dig more into what happened and being really moved by the history of residential schools in Canada as I learned about it in my life, was the Mennonite Connection. So for a long time, during the TRC, I kept asking leaders of Mennonite organizations, and I won't name names at this point, kept asking them, like sort of what's the Mennonite story? Because like we, settled on indigenous land too, so there must be we must be complicit in a way more than just settling on the land. And people told me no, Mennonites, it wasn't as bad because we didn't actually run any residential schools. So shortly after the TRC ended, I found out that we actually did, and that really broke a lot of trust for me. I felt like I was sort of betrayed by my own people, and I still have this sort of, as a Mennonite and as a first-generation Canadian, I have, I think, a different attachment to Mennonites as a people than maybe some other people do to their, religious group. Especially a lot of Christians don't seem to have the same attachment. But I call Mennonites sort of my people. And so I feel I want us to be accountable for our actions in the past, even if it wasn't me or, if it wasn't the case of the residential school I'm thinking of, it wasn't run specifically by the Mennonite Church Conference, and that's, I think, I speculate, a large reason for why neither the Mennonite Church in the USA or the Mennonite Church in Canada has taken responsibility for it, which really pisses me off, to be quite honest. Yeah. Because Mennonite identity is so collective and crosses generations so strongly, when it comes to other theological things.
Yeah, it's different than in the Catholic Church where you point at the bishop and that's the guy. If you want an apology, you just ask that guy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Because Mennonite history is so important to so many Mennonites, and then it's oh, well, no, this wasn't really us, so just because they identified as Mennonites doesn't mean, we should take responsibility for these schools. I don't know. It really bugs me. So, yeah, going back to your question of theology in particular, what got me interested in it was, so you have a Mennonite commitment to pacifism, generally, not across the board, obviously. Mm-hmm. But Mennonites are known for their commitment to pacifism and nonviolence, and so you had a lot of conscientious objectors in the Second World War. Now, what is never talked about is that some of these conscientious objectors worked as teachers in Indian residential schools as alternative service. That is something that was very striking to me, and really, I think, was sort of the linchpin to making me pursue this specific line of research, because I was what theologically allowed for this to happen, for, this explicit form of colonization not to be seen as a form of violence? Theologically, what's going on in these Mennonite communities that allow for such narrow definitions of peace and violence?
Yeah. That's a question that Dean and I have talked about kind of a lot, just in in terms of a larger Christian conversation about violence.
Yeah.
But I don't know. What do you think? What's at the bottom of that? Why did they? I mean, World War II has lots of. It's a really complicated situation.
Yes.
But what? I don't know. Why is serving the government in residential schools, I guess, better for Mennonites, less violent than World War II?
Yeah.
Maybe, just adding on to the way Matt just asked the question too. Mm-hmm. The frame that comes up in my mind when you were talking just now was why would it be less violent or not violent at all? Non-violent to participate in residential schoolings as opposed to killing fascists or something. That's a really weird way of kind of juxtaposing the commitments.
Yeah.
I was going to ask
that's a very interesting question, because there's some interesting things about Mennonites with relation to that. So there were some Mennonites who were kind of supportive of Nazism because the Germans helped them get out of Russia. And so that's a really long story, and that's really all I want to say about that now. But that is something that people have written about, and you can find articles on it. Mennonites don't like to talk about this, but that's another really sort of strange part of Mennonite history and Mennonite sort of how Mennonite identity gets wrapped up with weird national identities. But to answer your question, Mennonite definitions and understandings of violence, I'm painting with broad brushstrokes because obviously I recognize that things are always more complex, and you can always find groups that don't fit the norm in any group that you're looking at.
Right.
But generally, Mennonites have understood violence as a very physical and recognizable action. So starting with the Anabaptists, the refusal to use the sword goes all the way back to that. And not all Anabaptists believed that, but sort of those who shaped the dominant narrative among Mennonites were those who refused to use the sword. And that refusal then kind of carried over, okay, well, what's like the most overt form of violence now? It's like, war. And so we refuse to take up arms. But then don't really, recognize other forms of alternative service as supporting the war. And B, don't recognize certain forms of alternative service as violent in and of themselves. And that was the case. That latter part was the case with the residential schools. And actually reading through some documents, what I found was it wasn't simply an alternative form of service, but what was happening was the people who were working in the schools and starting these schools for Indigenous children, they were the progressive Mennonites of that time.
Wow.
In this group of people, and sort of in that region. And what happens in some of the letters between administrators and sort of conference leaders or other people in higher positions is this idea that it's being led by the younger people, and it's a form of religious inclusion. Now, try to wrap your head around this because it's very difficult. But at the time, some Mennonite communities were seen as very sectarian, even ones that weren't living, in their own communities, specifically isolated and, recognizably apart from the world. Like, I'm not thinking about Amish or Hutterite or Old Colony. I'm thinking of, sort of integrated, westernized Mennonites, but who are still more conservative and who maybe don't want a lot to do with the world and politics and stuff. And people of different religions and faiths, and definitely people of different race backgrounds. And so it was sort of the younger people who were pushing the administrators and church leaders to say, no, like, look, the way we understand the gospel is that we can't just, like, keep it to ourselves. Like, we can't be so sectarian. We have to go out and share the gospel with the world. We have to go where nobody else wants to go, and that's to these Indigenous communities. So that was kind of the theological impetus behind it, which, like, almost makes it worse. That's the more progressive viewpoint, and that there were conflicts in communities and in churches about do you let an Indigenous person who has converted to Christianity, do you let them worship with you in the same space and then you would have people arguing no. And then people arguing yes as a form of religious inclusion. This was the progressive thing to do. Conversion was the progressive thing to do. There's absolutely no recognition that that's violence at all.
Right. Yeah, that's so crazy to me because, I think for a lot of people, like Matt was saying earlier, who identify sort of on the left, Mennonites and, Anabaptists generally just become this this radical witness to the world or whatever, doing something totally different. And, they're the ones that emerged out of the Reformation with this kind of very, ahead of their time negation of abuses of power, etc.
But it's certain abuses of power.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like,
not within
it's really...
their own community, though.
Oh, okay. Well, that's even more ironic, right? Because the idea is you can only really feel that way about any group by virtue of never having spent time with them or met anyone who's a part of them.
Yeah. Mennonites can also be very self-congratulatory in a lot of these aspects. Like things like Mennonite Central Committee, the NGO, really gets praised for the work that they do and are kind of seen as like a front runner in how NGOs function across the world and the kind of approach they have to development work and peace work. But on the other hand, it's like I said, abuses of power, but really only like certain forms of power. Like I've sometimes said Mennonites are anti-statist, but not anti-colonial. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah.
And they might even be anti-imperial in some senses. Mennonites who are against other forms of colonization in different parts of the world. People who are Mennonites who are critical of the way that Israel is occupying Palestinian territory, for example, but don't have sort of the same level of critique towards Indigenous people in Canada. So there's that, and then I forgot what your question was.
Well, I was just sort of making an observation about, I don't know, how people relate to Mennonites as a sort of radical group.
I was saying, abuses of power in a certain way, but never sort of within or among Mennonites themselves. And so besides not attending to violence of colonialism, also a huge problem in Mennonite communities across Canada and the US is domestic violence and sexual abuse in churches and the silencing that occurs around that. And that I really don't want to hold that apart from colonial violence either, because Indigenous women were highly sexualized and continue to be highly sexualized, and that is part of the patriarchal regime in Mennonites that I think has affected both Mennonite women, was then internalized by Mennonite women, and in turn racialized, so that both white Mennonite men and women felt sort of this power over Indigenous people.
All right. Well, let me take this opportunity to overshare about my personal life and I don't know, explain a weird situation that I'm in, and I think it relates to the conversation. Okay, so I go to a Free Methodist church, and it's very Protestant and a really weird mix of high liturgy but very low church other stuff. Anyways, we had a society meeting very recently, and they made the mistake of putting me on the missions committee. I don't know why people ask me to do these types of things, because I don't know. I can only give some very limited limited input on things I don't know, capitalism is bad, and that's about it. Anyway, so they I'm in charge of it for a hot second until they find someone better to do it. But I was talking through what it is I don't know, missionary work is and does, and how churches kind of approach that. And the entire conversation to me is just hard to have, because so much of the overseas mission work that my church is involved in, and I don't know, I think just generally overseas mission work just comes off very colonialist to me, and very very imperialist. I don't know. I was just reading about some of the different efforts, and it just all feels really gross to me, and I don't know if I'm being overly critical or if it really is that way. And I don't know a lot about what's going on the ground anyways, but it just makes me wonder if you can be a Christian and abstain somehow from the colonialism that's inherent in mission work. Can we ever disentangle Christianity from its colonialist projects that have been, I mean, there's so much a part of this last century.
Yeah. That's a very, very common question that gets asked. And I kind of want to answer it in two ways. And so the first way is by saying I want to acknowledge and deeply, deeply respect post-colonial and liberative theologies and the work that indigenous Christian theologians have done and continue to do, both theologically as well as in their communities. I really, really respect that. I also have heard a lot of frustration from non-Christian indigenous people that the church's primary engagement has been with indigenous Christians, and there's still sort of this element of trying to decenter Christianity by including more indigenous theology. But what I have heard from non-Christian indigenous folks, for example, a couple of years ago, Justice Murray Sinclair, who was one of the people, I forget what his title was, but running in the TRC, one of the indigenous people heading the TRC, and really well known sort of across Canada as an activist, and he's a judge as well. We were at a gathering of Mennonites who are interested in and involved in Indigenous issues in Canada, specifically in Manitoba. And one of the things he said was basically that reconciliation will never happen until Mennonites can recognize Indigenous knowledge and spirituality as legitimate. And so as much as, decentering Christianity from its capitalist and colonial roots is a good thing, because I think that, liberative and decolonial theologies are much better. I think there also needs to be the efforts of the churches to come to a place where they recognize Indigenous knowledge and spirituality as legitimate, and where you don't have that Christianizing impulse anymore.
So recognizing that Indigenous knowledge and spirituality is a really good suggestion and recognition of the dignity of other people and stuff. Mm-hmm. In my neck of the woods, there's this tendency to gravitate sort of a certain hermeneutic of I don't know, biblical understanding, or I don't know, however you say that kind of stuff. About in Galatians where Paul says, there's neither Jew nor Greek or circumcised or uncircumcised, and that whole thing, and that turn towards universalism, I think, is often misapplied towards a universality of all people and a universality of all types of knowing, when we don't recognize the specific knowledges and experiences of people who are not just not Christian, but are kind of outside the experience of the white settler sort of understanding.
Definitely.
Anyways, asking white Christians to recognize the legitimacy of Indigenous knowledge is a huge step.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to add that I really think that asking the question, can Christianity be non-colonial, is the wrong question to ask. And it's a question that expresses this desire for purity that I think a lot of Christianity in Canada and the U.S., especially thinking of certain forms of evangelicalism, have. And I think a more helpful thing is to ask a question, sort of to recognize to say what are the complicities of Christianity, because it's almost like you're skipping ahead. Mm-hmm. This desire to like get out of the sticky situation of talking about what are the complicities, because we haven't not yet finished talking about those, and then to kind of jump ahead and say, well, like how do we create a Christianity that's not colonial? Like, when are we going to get to the place where we can say, all right, our work is done, and we're not violent anymore, we're not colonial anymore. Like, I think that's really misguided.
That's a good correction. I guess when I asked that question a few minutes ago, I guess my intention was like, I don't know, can we have a Christian practice that doesn't continue that type of violence, and still it's still getting too far ahead, but I mean, because you're right about that. But like, I don't want to do it anymore. Like, how do I stop? Like,
I think kind of what you're at. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what I hear from you is, besides the deconstructive work of decolonizing, what is a constructive way forward? Because you can't, like, there's not only deconstruction.
Yeah, I think that's a lot.
Like, you can't like stop living.
That's a lot better articulation of what I'm asking. Yeah, for sure.
And so I think only recently have I kind of thought about where I want to go with that. I think I've been reading some trauma theory, and also when I was working in Winnipeg with a community organization, they talked a lot about developing a trauma-informed workplace, and I took a lot of those considerations about space and sort of other affective elements of architecture and behavior and body language and policy and things, and I'm trying to think about that in terms of churches and theology, and what that has kind of led me to is, instead of trying to develop more and better peace theologies or better, more comprehensive nonviolent theologies, I think it would be better for us to take the approach that trauma theory offers and to ask, what does a trauma-informed church look like? What does trauma-informed theology look like? So that your goal isn't sort of absolute peace or untainted nonviolence, but harm reduction, and always harm reduction.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That makes a lot of sense to me, and also just seems to be a way of just reframing what it would mean to do something constructively. So I don't know, like Matt and I have a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics, in case you haven't heard. And basically, the whole idea is like we're trying to figure out, I don't know, like explore these questions of how Christians can contribute to like leftist projects and leftist, like action and activity. And a lot of the people that we've interviewed have, been from whatever, like a communist party or someone who works on, the Black Panthers, etc. And all that's very cool. And I like it. But also, I don't know, the way you're framing it here as, developing theological spaces and vocabularies that contribute to just harm reduction is such a good way of getting rid of some of the pathologies that Christians get into, or at least I get into, about like stressing out about whether or not you're contributing to the right political cause or not contributing to the wrong one or something.
Absolutely, because it totally changes your framework and the kinds of questions you're asking. Instead of asking, is this action nonviolent? You are no longer preoccupied with that, but it ends up being really people-centered. And so you're looking around and asking, who's experiencing the most harm and why? And how can we reduce that? And that, would actually allow the Mennonite churches and communities and other churches and communities to focus on things that often get, pushed to the side or silenced, like violence towards Indigenous people through colonialism, like sexual violence in our communities, like racism, anti-Blackness.
This is also a dumb way of putting it, but I'm going to do it anyway. It just seems like such a authentically Christian thing to do, which is to say, to think from the perspective of the victim, right? And that's sort of the cornerstone. like that. I don't know. I don't like framing things in terms of like, oh, this is what real Christianity is, because whatever, that's a bad way to frame it. But
I agree.
That being said, there is something that just resonates with, I don't know, what Jesus is doing in gospel narratives, and hopefully what Christians should do, which is find people who are suffering and just like try to work that out with them insofar as you can. I don't know. I like that a lot.
Yeah, because when I think about like what salvation means, salvation, salve, it's about healing, right? And then reading that together with trauma theory, and even with like the specific actions that Jesus did, like Jesus was involved in a lot of healing, and not only healing people from physical ailments, but like, the whole thing about release of the oppressors, release of the prisoners, like that. I see those things as form of social healing, as well as personal for those people, feeding the poor, clothing the naked, that sort of reference back to Isaiah. And I see that like really resonating with the framework of trauma theory and harm reduction. Like really healing is just another way of saying harm reduction, I think.
Yeah, or at least saying it that way is different than talking about healing as putting something back together, where it's sort of like your responsibility to like restore this to what it was supposed to be. It's just it gets rid of a lot of those really bad anxieties.
Yeah.
And oh man, okay, here's a connection. It also makes sense to me of getting out of the paradigm that might have led a Mennonite, for example, to participate in residential schooling, because as you were talking about it earlier in our conversation, it seemed like there's a way in which you could understand that wrongly as a kind of healing of the world or the cosmos or whatever. But hopefully, whatever, all these things can be ruined, but hopefully you wouldn't do such a thing if you felt like, thinking from the perspective of harm reduction or trauma.
Yeah, the language really wasn't of healing, and there wasn't sort of that trauma framework. Because Mennonites are like super bad at dealing with trauma because they're stoic and sweep everything under the rug. But yeah, like the sense I get from the documents isn't that it's an impulse for healing, but this really sort of Protestant, personal, internal understanding of like what it means to be saved. Your soul is saved.
Melanie, thanks so much for coming on and talking to us about your research. It's been really fascinating. Is there any other sort of resources you want to point people towards if they're more interested?
Yeah, definitely. I think if people want to learn more about the history of Indian residential schools in Canada, I think there's a documentary that I think it's still on Netflix. It's called We Were Children. It's a documentary interviewing two Indigenous people who attended residential schools, as well as some dramatizations in it. And I don't know what the demographics are of your listeners, but the dramatization is, I think, definitely safe for like children as well, because it's not very graphic. It just kind of hints at what happened in certain situations if there's abuses that happened. And then there are also two books. There's one written by a white settler, Paulette Reagan. Her book is called Unsettling the Settler Within, Indian Residential Schools, Truth-Telling and Reconciliation in Canada. Very nice, comprehensive, analysis of the residential schools. She worked alongside people who are running the TRC, and I think this is, exactly the kind of work that, white settler academics are responsible for doing. And then there's also the book by Thomas King called The Inconvenient Indian, a curious account of Native people in North America. Kind of covers, crosses borders between Canada and the U.S. I think a little bit more about the U.S. You can see some of the differences between the colonial climate in Canada and the U.S. there as well. So those books together and the documentary, I think, are a really helpful start.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for talking with us, Melanie. And this is all really good good stuff to know and research, but also incredibly challenging for Christians. So thanks for giving us that gift today on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a really great opportunity for me to get to share my work with other people who are interested in it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for listening to the Magnificast. Thanks to Melanie again for coming and sharing with us. So interesting. Definitely going to watch that documentary. There's a reading group that we're doing. You can sign up on our Patreon account. Check out our WordPress or our Twitter for more information on that. Also, simultaneously with this podcast, we're posting the reading group reading list that we're going to be focusing on this summer. And that all starts on July 11th. So take some time and sign up on our Patreon account, and you can get into that reading group and read stuff with us. All right. So, as usual, go follow us on Twitter at the Magnificast. Like us on iTunes. I don't know what you even do on iTunes. Write us a review. That would be great. Follow us on SoundCloud. Look at our WordPress page. Give us money on Patreon. Oh my God, there's too much stuff for y'all to do. But just do it. But do it. And listen to us again next week. Yay, Magnificast. Thanks for listening.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late.